All right, let's get started. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Setting an Equity Agenda, a City Hall Perspective, the third of 4 events in our forum. This is Emily Blum speaking. I'm the Executive Director of ADA 25 Advancing Leadership. My pronouns are she and her, and an image description of me for those who are blind or low vision is that I am a white woman with brown wavy hair. I'm wearing tortoiseshell glasses and a black sweater. I'm in my home office in front of an abstract blue, yellow, and green piece of artwork. We sent out a guide on accessing key accessibility features in Zoom, and we have both CARD and ASL interpreters. We also have Spanish live interpretation available. If you have any challenges accessing these features, please connect with us via the chat box. My colleagues will be monitoring and responding, so please keep that chat box clear except for technical issues. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, including so many Advancing Leadership members and those who donated to support the accessibility of this program and series. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with ADA 25 Advancing Leadership, we are a network of positive disruptors, all people with disabilities, including myself, who are using our power to create an equitable and inclusive society. And we believe our experiences, ideas, and leadership as people with disabilities are vital to achieving justice. Today's event and our forum, which is a 4-part series centering in-depth and action-oriented conversations on the intersections of racial equity and disability justice, is presented with generous support from the Disabilities Fund at the Chicago Community Trust, MacArthur Foundation, Grand Victoria Foundation, Polk Brothers Foundation, CDW, and Crossroads Fund. Thank you to all our sponsors and all of you who donated to support this forum. I want to remind those who signed up for the post-presentation breakout session that they will need to leave this Zoom meeting when we conclude at 4:55 p.m. Central and rejoin for the breakouts using the additional link in the Know Before You Zoom email right at 5 p.m. Following the presentation, our partner in this forum, Andrea Levant, will come on with directions for joining the breakout group. We will have CART, ASL, and Spanish interpretation available for the breakout groups. Engage with us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn throughout the forum using the hashtags Disability Power Influence and Disability Justice Forum. Okay, so on to today's event. I'm thrilled to be joined by and in conversation with 2 senior officials in the Lightfoot administration. With me today is Commissioner Rachel Arfa, who leads the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, and Candace Moore, Chief Equity Officer, who leads the Office of Equity and Racial Justice. Our conversation today will explore how government should and can connect disability and race in its policymaking, and we are going to get into some tough issues facing our cities. While Rachel and Candace will be reflecting on their experiences at Chicago City Hall, their insights are applicable to municipalities and communities in Illinois and around the country. But before we begin our conversation, I'm pleased to introduce a video by Mayor Lori Lightfoot to kick us off.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mayor Lori Lightfoot. My vision for Chicago is one that's racially and economically equitable, where the neighborhood you live in, the color of your skin, or your status as a person with a disability does not determine your outcome or access to opportunity. This is an issue that's personal for me. My father became deaf after a bout of meningitis. He was a brilliant man who had dreams of becoming a lawyer. But between his hearing loss and the fact that he was also African American with only a high school education, opportunities for him simply didn't exist. So instead of practicing law like he had hoped, he worked cleaning the factories around my community in Ohio. Though my dad's long since passed, his story and his experience are still very much alive in me today. It's an experience that informs my own commitment to equity in all its forms as mayor. Chicago's disability community is one of our city's largest and most diverse. Our mission is simple: We want to make Chicago the most inclusive and accessible city in the nation, period, no exceptions. A city that knows everyone has something to offer, and a city that supports everyone's God-given gifts, whatever they may be. This means taking on our most intractable challenges, facing our city head on in a comprehensive and holistic way. Issues like poverty, income inequality, COVID-19, and police reform, all of which disproportionately impact communities of color and especially individuals within those communities who experience disability. That's why I'm so pleased you'll be hearing from Candace Moore, the City of Chicago's first ever Chief Equity Officer, as well as Rachel Arfa, the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. Both these women are working together to ensure our city and city government works for all its residents. Though our work is far from over, we are on the path to changing the very definition of what disability means and what it means for the lives of countless Chicagoans in every community. From pity to respect, from a person needing to be cured to us as a city needing to address the inaccessibility, discrimination, and other barriers facing our residents. And we will not stop working until our city is one that is truly a place of opportunity, accessibility, and inclusion for every resident. Thank you, and please continue to be safe.
This is Emily Blum speaking again. Thank you, Mayor Lightfoot. That's great context as we get started. And welcome, Candace and Rachel. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Before we really begin, can we do a real quick intro and can each of you introduce yourself? Rachel, let's start with you.
And thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. So I'm Commissioner Rachel of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. They pronounce she, her. I include a visual description. I have brown hair that in the shoulder length, and I have hazel eyes, and I wear circle hoop earrings, and navy blue dress with a high collar. I'm in my city hall office. Behind me, you could see bookshelves, two sets of bookshelves with books and various objects. And I'm proudly deaf, I talk, and I speak for myself, and I read it, and I'm also fluent in American Sign Language. So today the interpreters are interpreting into ESR, and we also have captioning available. And I would also, go ahead.
Great. Candace.
Hi, everyone. My name is Candace Moore. I am the Chief Equity Officer in the Office of Mayor Lori Lightfoot. My pronouns are she, her, hers. A visual description of myself is I am a Black woman with dark black, kind of brown at the end braids, brown eyes. I have on a black dress and multicolored earrings for a pop of color. I am in my City Hall office as well. I've tried to make it a bit homey, so I have some pictures of historical Black images on the wall, and on my credenza in the back, there are some books, a globe, randomly a hard hat that someone gave me. It was sharing sort of their dreams of doing some economic development work. So I'm pleased to be with everyone today.
Thank you. Thank you both. And before we begin and really dive into policy and policy making, I want to start with identity, because for you both, identity is central to your jobs. And for the rest of us, the ability to see ourselves in today's leaders helps reflect our interests, our culture and values, and really the things that matter most to all of us. So can each of you talk about your identity, the power you get from that identity, and why it matters to your work? Candace, let's start with you this time.
Sure. So when I think about my identity, it's funny even to be asked this question because I realize what does that really mean? So immediately a Black woman comes to mind, and those two words together really define so much of myself and so much of my experience. But when I break them out, a Black person, also a woman, there are realities to my experiences that flow from each. And then I also think relationally, in terms of who I am in my family, a sister, who I am as a friend. And then in my career, I've been an advocate. And even as I sit in government now, I really sort of hold on to that identity as an advocate. I think all of those things kind of boil up into what I think about as my essential why. Why am I in this seat? Why am I doing this work? And it's because as a person who has experienced a life when you sort of look on the outside and you look at the demographics, you could predict, and books have and research has predicted outcomes for my life. And yet they don't match up with my experience. I've seen things that predict what the life of a person who grew up in poverty should be. And I remember what my life was, both the highs and the lows of that reality, but how they also have built me to have the strength that I have today, for me to empathize in the way that I do today, for me to believe that there is a opportunity for a reality that isn't defined in that way, that we don't have to be limited by these particular metrics and measures of who we are, and that I feel like I want to help try to do that. And so I tap into what I believe are my strengths, the strengths of connecting people, a strength of believing that people have the capacity to get this work, to grow in this work, and to contribute to building a future and to building a world that reflects their values. And, I bring all of that to who I am and how I do it. So whether I'm a lawyer in my career right before coming to City Hall, representing students and families around education, civil rights issues, to now being a chief equity officer and really trying to work inside of a system and make critical systemic changes that I think begin to allow us to build in the way that many of us believe is possible. All of that comes to the table, and I try to bring my whole self every day to that work.
And Candace, can you just give folks who are listening like a 1 to 2 sentence description of what does a chief equity officer do for a city like Chicago?
Yeah. So the I guess the most colorful way I'll describe it is sometimes I say I am the personal coach for equity in the city. And then the reason why I use that analogy is because my job is to help us grow, help us to get stronger, help us to build this muscle for equity, because I don't believe equity is just a destination. I believe it's also a process. And so part of how I think about my job is how can I work with departments across the enterprise to build their capacity to move toward more equitable policies and practices that drive at more equitable results.
Great. Rachel, can you talk about your identity and the power you get from that and why it matters to your work?
Yes, influence. So first, before I get into my identity, I will tell you that I do identify as a member of the 1825 Basic Leadership Network. And I've been, I'm very honored to be a member, and I've been fortunate to nominate many of our applicants in the past who are now fellows. And I want to say that some people that I nominated for the program were reluctant to apply, me being disbelieved that they were a fit for this program. And this was surprising. They were questioning their leadership qualities, qualification. And so I want to say to you that you're here at the right place. I see you, and this is the place that can help grow disability leadership. And you'll be often question ourselves within spaces that are not familiar. Should I be here? Why am I here and not someone else? And we'll be say, well, I'm not smart enough, these people are so much more smart than I am. They deserve to be here. I should be here. And I encourage you to remember that me a signal that you are in a space that's not comfortable. Yet it's easier to stay in a comfort zone, which maybe for many of us is sitting on the couch with Netflix. Right? But sometimes you have to get that courage to be uncomfortable. It is so if you're not comfortable, think about how you can use that to drive you to be able to represent in new spaces and grow. So I really believe that 8825 is a great way to grow out of a comfort zone and to grow as leaders. And I know you have a tough process ahead of you because the application process has closed or is about to close. It
Just
closed.
closed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about my identity. So my identity is central to who I am. And I've grown into my identity. Just like anybody else, we go through that experience of always learning and growing who we are and challenging ourselves to grow. So I'm a tough woman. I'm a Jewish woman. I'm a lawyer. My experience as an attorney, both as a South African, but also advocating for other people, has really shaped my understanding of the world. I started my experience as a legal attorney representing low-income clients in how secret consumer protection matters and get in a legal system that was not designed for any of us to be there. And then I also worked as a disability rights attorney, and I know that many of my former colleagues are on today's. So with this role, I've had this role since July, so about 3.5 months. And I'm really honored to have the opportunity to serve Mayor Lightfoot here at the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. So I think this takes the time to share what MOPD is. So this office was formed in 1890, shortly after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So just like the ADU MOPDs, 30 years old, they have a board commissioner. So I step into this role as the board. And out of the commissioners had disabilities, and I'm the first time commissioner, which makes me the first step person to step into some of these leadership spaces with other leaders. And I'm the highest rated person in the city government nationwide. It is something I think about a lot. What it means to be in a space where someone like me who's definitely requires communication access has to navigate and I'm constantly navigating my way through that space, both in person and in our virtual world. So about MOPD, so we have 2 office locations, one here in City Hall at the first floor, and then a second location at the west side of Chicago at 2102 West Acton, which is right across from the Jesse Brown BE next to the Illinois Medical District. So MOPD provides a number of services. We have a disability resource unit, which provides information and referral. We have a home modification program where we help make people's homes more accessible for people with disabilities, including it is usually the front entrance in the bathroom. When we want people to be with disabilities to be able to live independently, that we have employment services that are supported by the Social Security Administration, and we provide assistance to beneficiaries and SSI and SSDI who want to work. We need assistance navigating the world of work while receiving benefits. And then we have a program that provides outreach and training to the different kind of healing community about drug and alcohol education. We have a accessibility compliance unit that reviews accessibility plans and works to help us make the city accessible. We have a policy team, and so I'm really honored to work with so many talented people on my team to move forward what it means to make a city accessible.
Great.
And I was then before I took this role, I always looked at people in leadership roles, your people who are mayor, and I always wondered how do they know how to make difficult decisions.
Mhm.
And I put through a number of leadership programs, and I've learned that this role, I've had to make a number of decisions and then come to realize how my previous experience and my leadership experience and my life experience as a person with a disability and my exposure to many people in here and other people's doing has really informed the way that we make decisions, and who you are, the who absolutely matters, and how you lead this work, and how you lead with humility and make the right decisions for people. And so it's
Yeah, no, it's good to learn a little bit more about you both, and you reflecting on who you are as leaders and people in these positions is really helpful. So Rachel, you mentioned that you are 3.5 months in to your position. Candace, you two are also relatively new to your position. And in your case, your position is new to the city. So in fact, very few cities have either a commissioner for the mayor's office for people with disabilities, or a chief equity officer, let alone both. So Chicago is really unique in that way. In your very short time as colleagues, how have you discussed working together, and what is your vision for strong collaboration? Candace, let's start with you.
Yeah, so we have gotten a little bit of a chance to talk. I think, early, I always joke that there's a BC before COVID and then after. So we got a chance to talk BC about a lot of the ideas that we were planning and wanting to move ahead. And I think one of the things that I reflect on is the way I think about equity work is really orienting myself to systemic change. Well, how do we thinking about our policies? How are we thinking about our practices? And how are we thinking about building the capacity of our leaders to do the work? Because I think that's what lives on beyond our individual efforts. And I remember when Rachel and I were talking, we were talking about how important it is in our work to actually think about that in the intersections of race and disability and them separately, and think about how do we build those in systemic work. Because whereas I might be working on issues around hiring, there's an opportunity to open up that conversation to make sure we're talking about race, we're talking about disability, we're talking about gender, we're talking about, so the systems that we're creating are sort of working in service of creating more inclusion fundamentally, and really challenging the barriers that produce exclusion. And that's sort of being mission critical, and sort of the legacy of the work that we can leave behind, because systems continue after us. And so I think it's always necessary that we think about our work beyond ourselves, beyond a particular program or initiative, but also how do we lay the foundation and lay the tracks that continue to roll and drive towards this fundamental idea of inclusion, even beyond our particular sort of tenure in a position.
Yeah, that's I'm glad that you guys are having those conversations. Rachel, do you want to add to that? How are you thinking of approaching this work together?
yeah, so I that thinking is bigger than me, is bigger than you, is bigger than any one of us. And I think that a nice signal that when you're able to successfully communicate the importance of both with disability is when other people care about it also. If they are starting to work with it too. And I had a phone call actually to before this one where the people that was talking to were just as enthusiastic, if not more enthusiastic about making sure that disability inclusion is part of their process, in recognizing that it was not originally part of that process. And I found that so exciting because that is not just me having to drive that conversation, it's all of us working together And I want to make sure that as we move forward with disability outreach, that we include everyone with a disability. That includes reaching out, and making sure that we include every single community, including Black and Brown communities with disability who may or may not have a connection to a government, but we are here to serve every single community. And I want to make sure that we do the best job that we can as we move forward.
Where are you seeing this work done well? Are there other examples of cities or municipalities where you've seen strong collaboration among departments, specifically focusing on racial equity and disability? So Rachel, I'd love to keep with you. Where are you learning from in recognizing that we learn from both good examples and bad examples?
So I'm gonna support it to the extent I get to do is I'm learning about what other different departments are doing, and there's a lot of really incredible planning that's happening. And if I wasn't here working for the government, I would have no idea what's happening if they are up there through public engagement. I think there is such a thoughtful effort to make sure that everyone gets to participate. I'm also running a national phone call with other commissioners at mayor's offices for people with disabilities. And I brought up this question, and I see that there's no perfect roadmap. We're all trying to figure out what the path is. And I think that we could all learn from each other, but it's not because we all recognize wherever we are, whether it's in government, the not-for-profit sector, the private sector, the advocacy community, we all should have to recognize the importance in that these are part of our values at the city. And if we want to be surveyed regardless of what sector you're working in or what your role is.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm sure there's no perfect roadmap, but let's ask Candace if she's found one. You found a perfect roadmap.
I haven't found a perfect roadmap. I feel similar to Rachel that I have gotten into really deep and great networks with other cities who are doing equity work and building out equity offices. And I think there are some good examples of what does building a real inclusive processes look like. So I'm a part of this network that Policy Link brought together of chief equity officers, and in it is Asheville, North Carolina, Austin, Texas, Minneapolis, Albuquerque, San Antonio, Pittsburgh, Tacoma, and so it's kind of a big city, small city. Midwest, East Coast, West Coast. And so what's interesting is how unifying our challenges are in many ways, but also some big differences, the differences in the way our governments look, the way, quite frankly, politics works in certain areas. And so what I'm always looking at are how are people building systems within some of those constraints? Like, what is that? Like, how did you get to the answer or the strategy? One example that kind of pops up into my head is in San Antonio, they did this thing called Dream Week. And what I loved about Dream Week is that it was grounded in sort of racial equity, and it actually started from celebrating Dr. King, and they started with like a Dream Day, but multiple organizations could contribute to different events. And then it exploded into a week-long set of activities, which then exploded into about 2 weeks. So that is really like a dreams, season in some ways. But from there, all sorts of ideas and relationships amongst the communities are really generated with people positioning issues around equity, issues around race, issues around identity, and really bringing some of those intersections together as they show up in the community. And it becomes a place of civic engagement, civic imagination that I think really does strengthen overall how people show up to city government, which I think is just fundamental in this work. And that's the other piece that I would say is really essential, is that as we think about this work, strengthening civic engagement, strengthening civic space has been something that I sort of really walk away with in my work from a lot of what the other cities have done. It's essential. You can't do equity work. I'm not the sort of expert of equity. I kind of resist that in a lot of ways, but I do think I am a person who tries to create space. I do think I'm a person who's constantly trying to learn. And I do think I'm a person who wants to help other people learn and create that same space. And I think those are the lessons that I draw out of what other people are doing that I think give us a better shot at building the kind of work that we want to see in the city.
Well, let's get into what's happening in the city. Definitely want to talk about the intersections of your departments, but it's hard to do that without really thinking about some of the current issues facing our city. So earlier this week, the mayor announced that we are in the second wave of the pandemic, and beginning the summer and continues on, our city witnessed some protests against police violence. Both of these issues impact residents of colors, residents with disabilities, and residents of color with disabilities. So, how has 2020's most urgent pressing issues helped shape your understanding of what government is capable of as it pertains to urgent and quick advances for those needing disability rights, racial equity, or both? Rachel, let's start with you.
So I am to think about this, how years from now, when we look in our history books, how with history could look back at this moment. I think that this is a moment where we're shifting not just citywide, but nationally and globally. And this is really a moment where we need to respond and rise to the occasion. So, for example, the way that we work has shifted. Many people in the disability community know that people with disabilities who need a visible accommodation may have asked for an accommodation to work from home or to telework. If you are decades, if you said no, you have to come into the office. You need to be here physically, and overnight the whole world is working remotely. We're not working in our kitchen tables. People doing it now for 7 months. So I think that we prove that is possible. And now everybody is using Zoom and different virtual technologies. And with you, the exception for telework is people who are working on a front line, such as a medical professional, and then support staff working in the hospitals, and such as support staff, janitor staff, people working food service, retail, the essential service, and who putting themselves at the front lines every day. But I think then, in this pandemic, I started after the pandemic started, so I was able to see from an outside perspective what the response was. Now I'm working in government in AVDC, how much work really goes on behind the scene to provide a solution and above all, to keep people safe and to provide people with the support to be able to survive in this moment, get food, maintain shelter. And I always thought that government was a place for a creative solution. In the VDC, how much creativity there is here. And now both creators and I were able to use that creativity to really impact both people with disabilities and advance racial equity. So I think there's so much in the works that is happening and ongoing.
Candace, how about you? How has 2020 shaped your view?
Yeah, so I think what has been striking to me with especially around the pandemic is the power of like a unifying goal or like a unifying sort of situation. I mean, all to Rachel's point, overnight, we saw things shift when the answers typically are no, well, we'll see, we'll have to get that in the work stream, all sorts of things. But when things become kind of life and death in the way that the pandemic has shown us, when everyone and is really sort of, and I don't mean to sort of be flip in saying this, but everyone is up for grabs in terms of the impact that this can have, then I think what the spotlight that is shown is who is vulnerable, right? And I think COVID really sort of just shone a spotlight on the vulnerabilities that exist in our society, and it called out inequity in a much more powerful way that people could not ignore. And to that end, it becomes in our task of trying to save lives, in our task of trying to protect people, that we do have to call to question the fundamental questions of equity. Is what do people need in order to stay safe? Where are they at right now? What are some of the constraints that may exist for them, and how can we solve for that? These are basic questions that we think about when we think about an equity, and there's this massive use case. And so for me, as a person who was coming into this work thinking about how am I going to build that muscle, COVID has created an ability for me to say, this is the equity moment. These are the questions. They make more sense now. If you didn't think they made sense before, if they were confusing in some way, the evidence is in front of us. And your ability to create, to envision, to think past the barriers, because we don't have the same tools at our disposal in the same ways. We can't move the way we are comfortable moving. And so the pushing into that uncomfort is also a space in which we can build and innovate and move past barriers in such a powerful way. And I've sort of been floored by, I think, the powerful response of government in many, many different ways. Now, this doesn't mean things were perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I saw us do things that, literally months before, we thought about how hard a lift it was. Things like direct payment to individuals because they needed it, right? Like, because they needed money. We were able to do that. To stand up food access and really fill and plug in those gaps. We were able to do that, certainly through lots of partnership, but we were able to do that as a society. And so I think this moment has shown, and I think about it as sort of evidence that we can do a lot more. We can push much further. We can recognize that this is urgent, and that lives depend on our ability to get better at this, to get stronger at this, and to build the things that are not only protective, but the things that sort of mitigate the negative impacts that we have seen in our systems. And then I'll also just add that this racial reckoning that we are going through as a country, overdue, right? We needed to have this conversation. We have been lulled into a sense of complacency. Oh, maybe it's not that bad. Like, I literally remember at my time at the Chicago Lawyers Committee, there was this moment where we were talking about our work and the phrase civil rights, how do we still make it relevant to people? I laugh at that right now. But that was real. That was very, very real for advocates doing that work, is that people were saying the civil rights frame is outdated and it's really not civil rights, and don't we live in a post-racial America? There were real conversations around that. And this moment, for all of the pain and that is happening in this moment, it is an opportunity for us to have a very frank conversation about what needs to be done to to do the critical work that we often hide from because it makes us uncomfortable. But we are already here. We are uncomfortable, right? This is, this is our moment. And so what are we going to make of it? Is something I think a lot about, is how are we going to come together, even when we disagree, right? We have an incredible opportunity in front of us, and we ought not let it pass us by. And so we have to work harder, build more bridges, push in lots of different ways to try to get to take advantage of this moment, because it won't always be here. And so how do we work with that sense of urgency?
Yeah, because I think, what should also make us uncomfortable is lack of affordable housing, accessible and equitable transportation, our schools and the education system, creating clean and healthy environments that are accessible and available to everyone. Those are just a few issues. The list is really endless of where race and disability intersect. So, part of the solution, I would imagine, is that impacted communities are at decision-making tables. How do you and your departments influence who gets to be there? And how can you help ensure that those impacted communities their voices are heard? And Rachel, I'll start with you.
So we're digging into it because I'm looking at my own department first. I'm looking at other communities into task forces that we have to make sure that we have disability representation, but that we also have racial representation too. That is a basic benchmark that we need to make sure to meet before we proceed, to make sure that we have other different voices in life experience. And then committee, I see table, but now you don't have to worry about the table, so the virtual room. And then we want to explore that further, but I think that that's so important for us to really look at our representation and think about how do we move around at that. But I kind of these at the very least to that at the beginning in my own department with many relationships with other departments and to means that awareness too that disability does not only impact white people and also impacts people who are Black or brown and many different other identities. It makes sure that those perspectives are represented, that intersectionality does matter. The way that a white person with a disability may interact is going to be different than a Black person with a disability or a Black woman with a disability, for example. Yet we need to be integrate that perspective into how we decide and approach things here at the city.
Candace? Oh, go
ahead. For me, I think about sort of what kind of, for lack of better words, like powers I have. I think I have the power to create tables. And an example of that for me is the work we've done around the Racial Equity Rapid Response Team. We created a table to really address some of the disproportionate impacts that we were seeing coming out of COVID, and really zone in on communities that were most impacted. We brought together community leaders, government, healthcare providers to the table to solve a problem. And I think it's really important to note that we did not have a solution. I didn't have a sort of a secret plan that I was just trying to get pushed through that table. We all were wrestling with the same fundamental problem, but we believed that the answer existed in all of us. So we needed to have people who were closest to the work, closest to the institutions, to come together and work through and try to understand and push out solutions. And I've been really, really proud of that table that we've created. So that just reminds me that. And so what I try to think about is what worked about this, right? This produced not only great interventions and strategies, but this actually could produce a transformative kind of relationship between government and community. What does it take to keep doing this? What does it take to create tables? I also think about I do have the power and the ability to help people access tables that have already been set. So the mayor makes lots of appointments. How are we thinking about the diversity that we need in all of these different, whether they're councils or committees or et cetera? How are we thinking, even if my committee focuses on gender, how am I making sure that the intersectionality of gender is still represented in that committee? If we're focusing on economic development, right? How do we think about it through the spectrum of experiences and really create processes that allow for us to capture more people, because so often these things are just so networked to who do you know? How do we create opportunities? I know with the mayor's advisory councils, that was something that was really important to us. So we created an application process. Now, was it perfect? No, but it was a different way of trying to do something that typically those things have worked by, just people kind of self-nominating. And so how do you kind of open it up to create more space? And then the last thing I think about is, bridging tables, right? How do I recognize that at the same time, tables have been set, especially in communities, tables have been set and people are building power there, but there is some bridging work that needs to happen. How does that table get connected to a table that may be set in City Hall, and that the two together can work towards a common solution? Or how do I help people identify in government or in other spaces that I have access to, who are the right people to help you address what you are trying to achieve, or what are pieces are the solutions? So I think the power of tables are really, really important. And I think we can think about these in many different ways to serve at and our ultimate goals.
Thank you. I'd like to invite my colleague, Alex, to come on. I know it looks like we have a bunch of questions from our audience in the Q&A. So Alex, if you want to ask your first question, or the audience's first question.
Hi, this is Alex speaking. The first question from the audience, is getting right into it, is how are you using this budget process to advance equity and relief for people with disabilities right now, especially Black and Brown communities?
Yeah, so when I think about this budget process and where we're at as a city, I think we've had the challenge in front of us of trying to balance a really difficult situation, right? So we are in a state in which we don't have the revenues that we've had before, but I don't think that's a time to abandon your principles around equity. So how do we think about the critical services that we need to maintain? How do we think about the places where we can make some investments, still try to make those investments because they matter and because they're critical and life-saving? And how do we even think about the decisions where we have to cut, we have to roll back, and the impacts of that, and thinking about how do you do that in a way? I'm not gonna pretend that I think there's a perfect way to do this. I think you try to ground yourself in the experiences of people. You try to empathize with the things that you have learned and the things that people have told you. You look at the challenges and the constraints that you have in front of you, and then you try to put forward solutions that you think drive at and drive at the problems of today, but also invest in the hope that we need for tomorrow. And so I know, from my perspective, the team has tried to put a lot of thought into that, thinking about how we try to balance a massive deficit, $1.2 billion, and to do that in a way that still gives people so many critical services that are needed more now more than ever, and at the same time still try to build towards some of the work that we've been trying to lay the tracks for, and recognize that this is a step. This is a step in the process. We have to continue. We're not done, and I think that's just how you try to approach it, or at least that's how I sort of see it.
Rachel, anything to add? Otherwise, maybe Alex, because I know we have a lot of questions, maybe we can move to the next one and maybe make it for Rachel.
So I'm
Oh.
here to set it up beautifully, but I think that values in this budget, it will really be committed to be able to provide services is every part of our neighborhood, even though we've had so many hurdles with the pandemic at this deficit, and we were still able to move forward with making our city a better and more accessible city.
Great, this is Alex again, and the next question builds off that and actually touches on the issue of immigration rights, which we haven't touched on as much in this forum. So I wanted to make sure that I got a couple questions about that. So Chicago is home to a diverse immigrant community that includes immigrants, refugees, asylees, some of which have disabilities. And the question is, what is the city's commitment to protecting all of its residents, regardless of immigration status, for example, providing linguistic or culturally appropriate and accessible services? I was trying to fuse a few questions together.
Rachel, I can say a little bit about that, but I don't know if you want to start or if you have anything.
I need to go ahead and I can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So one, a lot of our work has been flowing out of our Office of New Americans. And one of the things that has been a core pillar of this administration is to make sure that all city services are accessible to our immigrant population. And so the mayor has done an executive order for all departments, whatever barriers there are that don't need to be there, and that, you know, in terms of really thinking about, you know, what do our forms look like, all of that. She's put in an executive order out for all departments that extended to COVID relief. Now, I won't lie, there's a rub there and there's a tension because we have a conflicting values at the federal level that prevent fuller access. But the mayor has been pretty clear and pretty dedicated to pushing from whatever levers we have as a city to make sure that the resources that we are putting out are not are not cutting people off. I will say one of the things that I've also observed that has been challenging though is fear. I think about testing, which is so critical right now, trying to convince communities in this environment when there has been so much narrative that against immigrants and against undocumented people, that it's safe to go to testing. You know, yes, this is coming from the government, but you can still get it. You know, that perception is so you know, such a reality. And so we you know, we try to do as much as we can in terms of the policies and practices, but we can't forget that we also have sort of a challenging narrative in front of us that we have to overcome. Some of the things that that we do a lot of work to try to do is to allow and support trusting relationships and actually work with through those relationships to get people the resources that they need. And so we've had great partners in the Resurrection Project and the legal navigators. We've done a lot of work to pivot and think about how the legal navigators who were set up to do one thing could work in service of something else during COVID, so that we could try to continue to move that work, but it continues to be a real challenge.
And I think the part of that challenge is that during this pandemic, our ability to have proximity to different communities has been completely changed, because instead of being able to go physically to different communities, we need to find ways to connect virtually and in other ways, but we also want to make sure that we do that safely and be mindful of digital barriers and access to the digital divide is real, but also not recognizing that there is fear out there, as Cletus mentioned. So I think that's something that we're learning how to respond and how we can do that outreach. That's not going to be an answer that comes overnight.
Well, Candace, Rachel, thank you so much. I'm going to invite our friend and colleague, Andrea Levant on. I would say that please join us for the breakout conversation. There's a lot more questions that we weren't able to answer, but we hope to get to some of that conversation in the breakout. Candace and Rachel have agreed to join us, so look for them there. And Andrea, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you both, Rachel, Candace, Emily, for that really substantive conversation. And I'll say, even though I don't live in Chicago, it's just what's really enjoyable or just enlightening is really thinking about, even for those of us that are not local, what this looks like in our cities. So thank you so much for that. Hello to everyone. For those who are joining for the first time, I'm Andrea Levant, president of Levant Consulting Incorporated, a disability-focused strategy and communications firm. Today, I am sitting in my living room with my bright teal couch and some pillows back there. I'm wearing a brightly colored dress with shades of yellow, orange, purple, and pink flowers and some green leaves. And I have on my teal and black cat eye glasses and shoulder length curly hair. I am again thrilled to be here to partner with ADA 25, Advancing Leadership, for these really powerful conversations around disability justice and racial equity. So we will now be moving to the breakout groups, where each group will be moderated by Advancing Leadership members. There will be CART and ASL in some of the rooms. If you find yourself in a room without the accommodation you need, please return to the main session and we will correct it. If you registered for the breakout group, please join using the link from the email sent to you yesterday or in the chat. And we hope to see you for our final session, which is next week. And just a reminder that each session registration is separate and required. Separate registration is required. So make sure that you are registered. We look forward to seeing you in the breakout group.